Hi, I'm Greg Salmieri. Welcome to another episode of Choose Your Issues, the podcast of the Objectivism Program in the Salem Center at the University of Texas. Joining me as often is Ben Bayer of the Ayn Rand Institute. Ben, why don't you tell us what's on our agenda for today?
So I had the idea that it, it would be nice to, and the topic of freedom is something that we talk about a lot on many of the episodes that we do. We should take some time to have maybe a bit more of a timeless discussion of the topic of just what is freedom. And here's a couple of examples of how I think this has come up in a number of the podcasts we've done recently. Just last week, we've done two episodes, I think, on the topic of academic freedom. Last week, we were talking about the controversy at Hamline University, where a professor was disciplined by the university, let go because she showed some pictures of Muhammad, paintings of Muhammad. The university accused her of Islamophobia. Her defenders came to her defense in the name of the concept of academic freedom. We talked about academic freedom a fair bit last week in the previous episode.
I count myself, and I think you would too, as among her defenders. It's just, I don't think this is
But
the
we
right way
didn't
to conceptualize
think
the
that
defense.
using the concept of
Yeah.
academic freedom was the best way to make sense of it, especially because the concept has some conceptual problems, in particular the way it thinks about freedom.
And this came up earlier when we were talking about the conference on academic freedom I was at Stanford, and it's come up in other contexts. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the second major example where there's a confusion about freedom that's at the root of contemporary controversy is the issue of free speech. Free speech is, I think everybody thinks of it as a kind of freedom. But if you look at many of the debates that have many of the debates in the culture wars lately, especially about social media companies and regulation of social media companies, there's the idea, especially prominent, I think, among many conservatives and libertarians, that free speech means that certain kinds of viewpoints should not be excluded from conversations on these platforms, and that when someone like Twitter decides we think this person's spreading misinformation, hate speech, what have you, that if the person's deplatformed, kicked off Twitter, that's a violation of their free speech.
I'd add, you mentioned among groups who think this, libertarians and conservatives, but also you find a lot of what you might have thought of as strange bedfellows with kind of old line Marxists joining in that coalition, arguing that. And this is an old left idea, this way of understanding free speech. It was a big idea in the uh, around the so-called Red Scare, and it's part of the lionizing of figures who are blacklisted or supposedly blacklisted in Hollywood and so forth.
Well, and academic freedom is also an idea that
Yes.
comes from the old left, and it's interesting how it's been taken up by the right recently in these various conversations about professors getting deplatformed. And what struck me about both of these examples is, I mean, there's a common view of what freedom is that's at work, such that if you think the professor gets fired or the tweeter gets deplatformed, that their freedom is being violated. And it's something like the freedom means the right to use a certain kind of platform, to be enabled by that platform, to use the resources that are being provided by that platform on some conception of this is the public sphere, all viewpoints need to be represented in the public sphere, and therefore it's a violation of freedom if they're not. Something like that.
I would say it's a little wider than that, because it would also be of the same mentality would be you shouldn't be able to be fired from your job for saying things. You have an unpopular political opinion, and that's not maybe using the platform. Maybe you didn't say it at work, but you got fired from work when it became revealed that you thought such and such, whatever the such and such is. And I think it's widely thought that that's a violation of someone's free speech, and I don't think it is. It may well be unjust and poor management practices, and in many cases, I think it would be both of those things. But I don't think it's an issue.
Okay, so two questions to then get us into the broader topic of what is freedom really. You just said you don't think these examples really are violations of freedom, either free speech or whatever freedoms associated with academia. why not? And can you say something also about, are there ways in which the concepts these people are using, the concept of freedom these people are using, is actually encourages certain abridgments of real freedom?
Yes, I do want to. I have some things to say about that, but I also want to just, as a matter of um, protocol. So we're here in a room. We've got a bunch of people here with us. We're meant to have a camera on that other mic. We don't, but that mic's active. And what's happened in the past is we've gone back and forth for a while, and then maybe somebody's come up and said something. But um, if people, this is a topic a lot of people have opinions on. If anyone has, doesn't have to be questions. It could be thoughts, things they want to add to the conversation. Come up to the mic. We'll notice that you're there, and we'll try to work you in, so it's not just the two of us going back and forth on this for however long we're doing this. Part of what we're trying to do with this show is take advantage of the being in a place where there are a lot of people who might want to discuss this stuff. So, anyway.
So why aren't these
feel
really
free to go up to the mic.
Violations of freedom to start with?
Well, the thing I'd want to start with is noticing what kind of conception of freedom is involved here. Because suppose I run a business and I have a very strong ideological position. I'm, let's say I'm a Republican, but I'm all about being a Republican, and I really think the Democrats are awful and wicked and evil, and I bought into whatever the most kind of, not just that I very much favor Republican policies, if I could figure out what those were, but that I have this kind of culture war attitude where the Democrats are bringing us to ruin and so forth. And I wouldn't want to let my daughter date a Democrat, and I wouldn't want to have it. I wouldn't break bread with a Democrat and so forth. And then I run a little shop, whatever. I run a corner store. And I don't want to have any of those Democrats
How about
for me.
What if you run a cake shop?
If I run a cake shop. But I want it to be about beliefs, because the cake shop thing is about practices and homosexuality and maybe identity, and maybe it matters that the homosexuals are gay people are protected class, and maybe it matters whether people are born this way or it's a choice. So let's just take it about beliefs, where it's unambiguous. I hate Democrats. Maybe I have no problem with gay people, but I have a problem with Democrats. If you voted, like
if they want to have the cake say "I love the Democrats,"
right? Right. Anyway, but I wanted it about the employment. So I'm happy to have Dave Rubin in there, but someone who votes blue, gay, straight, black, white, whatever. I don't want them in my shop, and I don't want them working for me. More to the point. And then I find out that one of my employees is a Democrat, and I want to fire him. He voted for Biden in the last thing. So suppose I'm this guy, and this is what I want. So the question is, either the law is such that I can't fire him even though I now want to, or it's such that I can, right? And someone's ability to do something they want to do is constrained one way or the other. I can't have the employees I want and get rid of the employees I don't want for whatever reason I want if I'm not allowed to fire him. On the other hand, he can't have or express whatever political views he wants and keep his job if I'm not allowed to fire him, right? If I am allowed to fire him. So the question is, like, if you're going to think of it as freedom, someone's not able to do something they want to do. Someone's constrained, hemmed in, doesn't get their druthers. He wants to work for me while espousing views that are anathema to me. And I've made this example where I seem very unreasonable in doing this, but maybe it's not just that I hate Democrats. Maybe I hate Klansmen, or maybe I hate people who are members of QAnon and who I think will use whatever money I, give them in their employment to, support causes that I loathe. It doesn't matter what the view is. Right? The view that you shouldn't be discriminated on in your employment status based on what you say, right, takes this kind of view of your job is something you have a right to. Your employer doesn't have a right to decide who he hires or not. He doesn't have a right to include his beliefs about what things are good or bad, what things are right or wrong, what things he wants to support and boycott in his hiring practices. His ability to choose what ideas he supports, that he doesn't have. But you have a right to continue drawing a salary from him regardless of what you espouse, right? So you could just as well say that it violates the employer's right to free speech, as you could say, the employee's right. And I think, in fact, it's not that you just as well. It, in fact, violates the employer's right to freedom of speech and freedom of association, which I think are very, very closely tied together. To say that he can't discriminate based on people's viewpoints in who he employs. Why is it viewed otherwise? Why is it viewed that it's me, the employer, who's violating free speech if I fire somebody for saying, holding beliefs, etc., that I disagree with? Well, there's a kind of idea that commercial decisions somehow have to be separated out from decisions about ideological content. As the employer, I have power over him, and I'm using this power to constrain him, and it's that kind of power that limits or prohibits freedom. And maybe it's fine for people to have some freedom about their commercial lives or some freedom about who they hire and not in some spheres, but that has to be kind of not exercised over issues of speech or ideas. Free speech is understood on this conception of free speech, which I don't think is the right one, as a kind of special thing that exists outside of the rest of our decisions. You have a right to speak your mind, to say what you want, to not suffer consequences for it, including economic consequences that might come from other people's decisions, including other people's expressions of their ideological convictions. Your ability to express yours is protected. Protected from what? Well, protected from other people choosing not to associate with you. Which amounts to saying that you're owed certain forms of association from them, at least if you already have them, regardless of what you think, regardless of what ideas you express, regardless of what causes you ally yourself with, etc. So it amounts to you have a right to a platform from them. You have a right to support from them, regardless of your ideas. And so people should have this kind of freedom with respect to their ideas that entitles them to being regarded as appropriate to deal with, being hired or not, at least not fired, being supported, being considered not beyond the pale, not being boycotted by people, right? That's the kind of premise behind this kind of conception of freedom. And people then get cagey or worried about it when the idea becomes too extreme. Well, okay, if somebody wanted not to hire, we won't hire any Democrats, we won't hire any Republicans, that's obviously ridiculous. Nobody should, that's a violation of free speech. But if it was any Nazis, well, that kind of makes sense. What about communists? No, communists you have to be able to hire, but maybe if they're Stalinists, maybe not then. But if they're, Trotskyites or whatever, or think Mao was the bee's knees, then they're fine. So it's basically there's some kind of group of people that are, seen as beyond the pale, but without respect to those, if they're not held as beyond the pale, then how do you define that? Then everybody's owes them some kind of living, or at least not boycott, not blacklisting them. That's the kind of conception, and that's the conception that came out in the kind of 50s when people were, defending communists in particular, on the holding the line that their freedom of speech was being denied if people blacklisted them, wouldn't employ them, etc.
So it sounds like part of what you're saying here is that, I mean, you're invoking an idea that usually conservatives, libertarians make a lot more reliance on, which is economic freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying something like freedom of speech, freedom of association. Traditionally, these are viewed as freedoms within the private sphere that you can't separate, you can't detach these kinds of freedoms from economic freedom. This is the free mind and free market are corollaries idea.
And in general, I think Rand's view and my view, the issue developed, I think, forcefully, is that there's just one thing, freedom. There's just one thing, liberty. There's not economic freedom, and then there's personal freedom and sexual freedom and freedom of speech and so forth. There's just one thing, freedom. And you see it in different aspects. You could notice it in different fields, or some people are more zealous protectors of it with respect to one domain than another. But to really understand what it is, you have to think of it as this one thing. There's just freedom, and then there's what it looks like in different contexts. And no freedom can, if properly understood, can step on or delimit any other. If you don't view it that way, and there's a question about what that looks like, and we'll talk more about that. But if you view it the way that we've been talking about now, that we're objecting to, you end up having to think that freedom is not an absolute. It's always a balancing act. The academic freedom of the professor has to be weighed against the freedom not to be offended by the student, has to be weighed against the freedom of the student to have an education without suffering undue an unwelcome environment, and etc. And you get this kind of weighing of freedoms, which I think is a kind of, by the time you've done that, you've kind of given up, I think, on the essence of the idea of freedom.
Do we want to?
I want to hear what Tully has
see
to say. It's not a break. It's part of the program.
A break from the main program to go to the Q&A.
It's the main event. It's not Q&A. It's lively discussion.
Go for it.
Do you two want to figure this out? No. So when you force an employer to do something, or like when you force, let's say, Facebook to allow a point of view that they don't want to allow, and this is something that conservatives, many, are pushing for. Now, I understand why that's a violation of Facebook's property, but I've heard it said that it's a violation of Facebook's free speech to force them or to prohibit them from banning, let's say, conservatives. But how is it a violation of Facebook's free speech? Because on one hand, we're saying they're a platform, right? They're not a publisher, so they're not liable for what everyone is posting legally on their platform. They're a platform, but then forcing them to do something with that platform is now a violation of their free speech. I'm confused about that.
Well, I think there's a distinction between publishers and platforms that I think is relevant for a tort and liability context. Did you yourself say this thing, or did you merely tolerate it being said, or make an environment in which it could be said, or whatever? And that has differences for like how you're responsible if the thing that was said turned out to be slanderous or libelous or whatever. But I don't think free speech is really separable from freedom of association. There's a kind of endorsement you're giving of somebody when you deal with them. I wouldn't deal with Hitler. I am dealing with this guy, so he's better than Hitler, in my view. Right? There's something that you're making a statement by all of your associations, and particularly when your associations are involving what speech you strike down. Either where you strike it down specifically, I'm deleting this comment by this person, or where you set policies for what kinds of things you're striking down. You're creating an environment, a forum for discussion. And I think it's part of what the free speech right protects is the ability to do that, to create fora, to create platforms, to manage platforms for discussion. And don't just think about a YouTube platform, but like you have a literal bulletin board, a piece of cork stuck up, and you have policies for what can be put up on there. And sometimes you take stuff down, and sometimes you don't. You haven't said the stuff that's there, but you have the right to this thing. It's a property right. But part of what a property right gives you is the right to do things with that property. And part of what you want your property for is to be able to express your ideas on it. Not just your own ideas, but also ideas about what a healthy conversation looks like and what things should be in and out of that healthy conversation.
So even
or
if
again, you run like a coffee shop, and you like let people come and speak their piece in the coffee shop, but there are some things you'll throw people out for saying if they go on a racist tirade or something.
even if you publish a wide array of views in your newspaper, even if you host a wide array of books in your bookstore, nobody takes it that you're agreeing with all of them because they contradict each other. You can't believe all these things at the same time. But they do take it that you think these are worthy of consideration, that this is a good conversation to have. Somebody should be able to read this book. If there's a debate happening in your newspaper, this is a debatable topic. You maybe even have a view about which side you agree with, but
you're expressing a point of view about what's open for debate, what's reasonable. And there are several different points. So like publisher isn't the same as speaker. right? It's already one step removed. And so there's like publisher, speaker, publisher, platform. You might say, I'm a publisher. I disagree with this guy, but I think his view ought to be heard. You might say, I wouldn't have published this, but I'll carry it in my bookshop. You might say, I wouldn't sell this thing in my bookshop, but in my public reading room that I, allow people to, in my coffee shop, I'll let someone come in and read this book. I won't throw them out for having it there. Or you might say, no, you can't come in here with a copy of Mein Kampf or something. This is not that kind of reading room.
And this isn't just theoretical. Like, these are the actual kinds of issues that will motivate people who have platforms to want to kick somebody off the platforms. Like, I don't want to be seen as supporting this racist or whatever. And because the being seen is a message that is being sent to the public, and they have a certain view of what they want to communicate to the public.
But also about what kind of environment they want to create. So if your view is like, this is a place for people to have their family photos and chat about it or whatever, and I'm fine if some politics comes in, but not things that are going to scare away the kids or the people, then that's going to have a view. Like, what kind of space do you want to create? What kind of activities are you comfortable having in your space and so forth? And what's your brand? And I'm trying to attract advertisers, and Pepsi doesn't want to be seen with this kind of content next to them or whatever. And so that's all part of the image people are trying to create, and that they're right to try to create because they're offering products. If you're running a bookstore or a coffee shop or a web page or whatever, you're in the business of providing a certain kind of experience, and that's a kind of intellectual product analogous to, not identical to, but the same kinds of rights involved as if you were making a painting. And
let me ask you a question now that I think is going to transition us to our bigger topic, which is what is freedom generally. Mm-hmm. You started off with an example where you think somebody should have a certain freedom to hire and fire employees according to their political ideology, one that you don't necessarily agree with.
And I don't agree with it.
That's for the record then. Why then is it so important someone be able to do? What's the value that's at stake? What's the positive value that's at stake? Even if you think these people aren't achieving positive values in firing, let's say, people they disagree with, I mean, you must think this because you think there's some positive value at stake that this kind of freedom of association and speech enshrines and protects.
Yeah, but let me step back even from it let me see something sort of intermediate about it. When we're talking about freedom, or we're valuing freedom generally, we think about why value freedom or what's good about freedom. It's something like, I can't be imposed on or constrained in some way by other people. Right? Someone, if I'm unfree, it's because someone's interfering with me or constraining me or doing something akin to imprisoning me in some way. They're constraining me. And one of the things you might think about is, in these kinds of cases, who's doing that? Where is the constraint from, and how do we think about it? And what is it to be unconstrained or to be free? Free from what? And I think of the idea as sort of fundamentally, to be free is to be free from one another. So if you think about the case of, you have the guy who doesn't want to employ someone anymore because he holds views that are odious to him, and you have the guy who wants to be able to express his views regardless of what his employer thinks about them, right? Which one wants to be free of the other person? Well, from the employee's perspective, what's happening is the other person is constraining him by threatening his livelihood, threatening to fire him if he says what he wants to say. But the threat to fire him is simply a threat to disassociate with him. If the employer and his business didn't exist, then this guy who has views that the employer hates would be in the same situation as he is if the employer chooses not to deal with him anymore. All the employer can withhold from him is his employee, the relationship with him. So I think it's the employer who actually wants freedom. He wants the freedom to associate or disassociate. The thing he wants to be able to do is it be as though he's not there. He wants to be able to be free of the other person. The employee doesn't want to be able to be free of the employer. He precisely wants the employer not to be able to be free of him. What does it mean to be free of someone? It means something like not to have them in your life, not to have them act on you, to be able to function as though they weren't there. Not like in every way as though they weren't there, exactly, because like to walk through them or swing your arm in the place where they are isn't acting as though they, I mean, it is acting as though they weren't there, but we think, well, then you are. So the question is to like, how do you understand what it is to be around people, to have other people in the world, and yet to be free of them? And I think that's kind of what we're trying to understand in understanding the concept of freedom. I think that's the essence of it. What is it that we can be with each other in the world, but be dealing with each other only voluntarily? And then what is that? And then what is the value of that? And that's kind of what I go to when trying to understand what the concept of freedom is really about. But we have someone else who's got a contribution.
Well, but wait, because you still didn't answer my question, which is, so you said something about what freedom is, but what is in those examples of freedom of association concerned with employment? Why is it so good and important that we be free from each other in that regard? What's the value that's at stake in even if you don't think this Republican firing Democrats is achieving the right political values, there must be some value in common.
Common between them?
There must be some value that you think is at stake in for the rest of us, even if not for him, if he loses that right and that freedom.
So what I'm saying is the value. There's still the question as to why it's a value. Is the ability to be free of one another, the ability to go your own way. And then the question is, why is the ability to go your own way?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Value. But that's what I want to postpone until I hear what someone else has to say.
Well, I think the threshold question regarding freedom may be, at what point does the government get involved in enforcing your rights? If you and I are having a conversation and I disagree with your views, I can walk away from that conversation. Should the government enforce your right to make me listen to you? Clearly not. I think everyone would agree with that. I could also hold out my hand and put it over your mouth to make you shut up. The government should then enforce your right for me not to interfere with your right to free speech. So I think the important threshold is, at what point does the government get involved in enforcing a right, i.e., does the person have a cause of action against the other person for impeding the other person's freedom? And I think the answer, unless it's obvious, is to err on the side of freedom. The government does not get involved. Clearly, if there's a tort involved, I put my hand over your mouth, that's assault, I mean, a number of different things, battery possibly. The government should get involved in enforcing my right to have you not do that. But as far as me walking away and not listening to you, the government clearly shouldn't get involved in that. So,
well, so there's a kind of heuristic there of like, when the government shouldn't get involved, but we disagree, or people disagree anyway, about when the government shouldn't get involved. That's coming up in a lot of these cases. Should the government get involved in Facebook or not, and so forth? This is one thing that people are disagreeing about. And you could say, well, there should be a default that the government shouldn't get involved, and the burden of proof is that they should. In a way, I agree with that, but in a way, I don't, because until we say what it would be to satisfy that burden of proof that the government should get involved, I don't think it really answers much. And government not being involved enough, I think, is as bad a problem as it being too involved. So you gave the case of the guy who shoves, you say the thing I don't want you to say, and I put my hand over your mouth or punch you or whatever. If we're living in a country where the government won't do anything about that, where the government won't arrest me or stop me from punching you, I think we're living in as bad a country as if the government punches me itself. I mean, that is, if the government is systematically not acting to defend the freedoms that need to be defended, I think we're in the same kind of situation as if the government is acting where it shouldn't to curtail people's freedoms. So the thing that I think the government brings in is force being used, right? Because the government's job is to use force, and it's to use force in retaliation for other people's having initiated force. And so I would say the kind of thing to think about is has force been used here? And the government should use force if someone else initiated it, but it shouldn't initiate force. But once we're understanding it in that context, the government's failing to retaliate with force to force initiated and letting some people, run rampant with their use of force against others, or letting it run rampant on some issues, I think is the same kind of error as the government's imposing force where it shouldn't. It's letting force get wielded capriciously in the society, thereby delimiting people's freedoms.
Well, to go back to let's talk about the three examples. One, I clearly have the right to walk away from the conversation. It may hurt your feelings.
Mhm.
The government should not get involved with me hurting your feelings.
Agreed.
We all, I think, agree on that. If I put my hand over your mouth to make you stop talking, I think we all agree the government should get involved
Right.
and tell me I can't do that. The question becomes somewhere in the middle where if I say to you, if you don't quit talking, I'm going to punch you in the nose.
Uh-huh.
That's a gray area.
I don't think
I haven't
it's
actually
gray.
punched
That's
you in the nose, but I've threatened you should the government get involved in that. And that's so in other
well,
words,
for
you
me,
have
that's
this,
not gray. That's the same as if you cover my mouth. I mean, that's what's
no,
called
it's
a
not.
real
It's
threat.
not exactly the same. What if I say if you don't quit talking, I'm going to say bad things to other people about you? Should the government get involved in that? We've got these gray areas, and I believe that where it's gray, the government should not get involved. Freedom should reign. People should be allowed to say what they want to say, and the government should only get involved if it's a clear case of one person's rights have been infringed by another.
So, like, if
we're
I
kind of-
pull a gun on you and say your money or your life,
Clearly, that's clearly you're threatening me, and I think the government should get
so
involved.
if I pull a gun on you and say shut up or your life,
Government
same
should get involved.
but if I
Anytime
pull a fist on you, it's different than a gun?
No. If I say, if you don't quit talking, I'm going to punch you in the face, I think the government should get
Okay, so
probably
we
involved
are in the
that.
same case
But
side
at
on
what
that one.
point does the government not get involved between me just walking away, which I clearly have the right to do, or if you don't quit talking, I'm going to say bad things in public about you? Should the government get involved in that? I don't think so.
So, from my way of thinking, this isn't you're presenting it as a continuum.
Correct.
And I don't-
where does the government get involved is the question.
I don't see these as a continuum. So, there might be gray cases, but I don't think of it as a continuum in the way you're presenting it. Because I think if something is an initiation of force, and therefore if something is something that the government should do something about, then the threat of that thing is the same. Is also that once we establish that the thing is an initiation of force, then the threat of the thing thereby counts as initiation of force.
Agreed.
So the punch is an initiation of force. So the threat of the punch is an initiation of force. If it's a credible, real threat, and it's not just hyperbole, but I'm really saying I'll punch you. So the question then becomes: is saying bad things about you an initiation of force? And if it is, then the threat to say bad things about you would be an initiation of force too. And if it's not, the threat to say bad things about you wouldn't be. So I think it's just I don't think the threat goes with what it's a threat to do. Whatever the status of the thing that I'm threatening to do is, if that should be illegal, then the threat of it should be illegal, and if not, not. And so the question is, where do we put saying bad things about you? And I think, at least in part, it depends on what kind of bad things. If I'm just going to insult you, surely it's fine. If I'm going to slander you, if we're talking about blackmail, then we get into a situation of, are slander and blackmail properly crimes? Are they properly torts? Are they properly what? And that, I think, is a kind of more difficult area of kind of legal philosophy.
Agreed.
So I wonder if some of these kinds of questions will be easier to address if we do try to lay down some fundamental positive principles. So back to my question, which is now you've just fleshed out what it means for people to be free from each other. You've said it's something to do with being free from force. That
Right.
came up a lot in your answer. But
even the question of what counts as force goes back to what counts as freedom in the first place. Is a hungry man not free? Am I not free if I've lost my job? Have I been forced? And so these kind of concepts, seem to be interdefined to a lot of people.
right. So what is it that freedom from force gets you that the freedom from hunger in the Roosevelt example doesn't?
Just that was one of Roosevelt's four freedoms. How
Yeah.
many did he have? Yeah. Okay. Just because we didn't reference him. Okay. It's not what it gets you. It's about what your relationship is to other human beings. I mean, there are situations in which you're better off in a period under some force than hungry. You can imagine a situation where somebody's, on an island starving to death, and they're going to die, by the end of the day if they don't get any food, and they get rescued by some Nazis and put in a, whatever.
So what is it that freedom from force enables?
Right.
You
So the
to
point
do?
isn't that force is the worst thing that could ever happen to you, or that force is worse than hunger. In some, you can come up with some circumstance in which, it's better a guy comes and punches me in the face, but he also has some food to offer or whatever. But what we're talking about, the concept of force and freedom, these concepts live in the context of when we're thinking about how human beings ought to live together. They're concepts about how human beings interact, what kind of relationships with other people are appropriate. What is the value of other people to you, and under what condition are other people of value stably and over time, not just in some one-off situation where, whatever, you encounter someone right as you're starving to death, and maybe whoever it is, he's welcome in that situation. And so there are concepts about how to live together, and the way I think about it, the fundamental human need is to live by our minds. We fundamentally live by our thinking, by our minds, by figuring things out and acting on them. And all that we have to offer other people comes from our doing that. And all that they have to gain from us comes from our doing that. And all that we have to gain from them comes from their doing it. So other people live by their minds, live by their thinking, and are values to one another because of that. I mean, it's in the concrete. If the person has some food to give you, it's because they've thought some way, figured out what things are food and made it. If they have some, anything they can do because they can think. And what are they doing with their thinking? Well, I think to the extent that they're living well, and this is to the same extent that they can be of value to one another, what they're doing is forming values that are self-sustaining for them, pursuing them across a life by a process of thought and production, doing that under the guidance of their own mind. And it's a holistic process. It's not like they're thinking now and talking now and producing now, and these are little separate moments. They're rather engaged in a life that they've, are kind of charting and navigating under the course of their own mind, creating values to do it, thinking about how to create those values and about what things are worth creating, maybe talking to one another about how to do that better and what things are good and bad and true and false. And it's in that context that I think if the other people are going to be of value to us and we're going to be of value to them, it's going to be by their identifying that we have something to offer them in their lives and our identifying that they have something to offer us. And so that each of us can go on living this kind of life directed by our own mind, but together, interacting together, trading, dealing with one another in some way. And that presupposes that the interaction is voluntary, is chosen, and that there's an alternative open to each of not interacting with the other. We can deal with each other, or we can go our own way. And I think freedom is the condition in which you have that. You're able to deal with people or not on your own choice. And that includes dealing with the things they've produced or created or not, based on mutual consent. And so in order to define what that is and what that looks like, well, in a very obvious case, you have, two people each plop down on a island or whatever, and do you go up and try to like hit the other person or not? Do you try to take something he's just fashioned, or do you kind of negotiate with him about how to get it? Do you deal with him as though he's a thing there on that island for you to figure out how to get something out of, like it was a force of nature, or do you deal with him like another mind to negotiate with? And the right way, I think, is to deal with them as another mind. It's the way that's best for you, that's best for him. It's the way that people can live together. Once you have people living sort of on top of one another, thousands of them, hundreds of them in the same place, and they're all building things, and they can inadvertently step on one another's toes, and you have a long-term project of developing this piece of land in this way, and I might not realize, and I might walk across it and ruin it, and so forth. Then we need, I think, more complicated principles to kind of define and mark off the scope of where does my life end and your life begin. But the basic idea is that each of us is engaged in a project of living his own life. And we're trying to do it concordantly with one another, in the same place as one another, with each of us still free to lead his own life in association or not in association with other people.
Okay, but a moment ago you said when the interactions are voluntary, that's best for both of us. But I want to go back to your original example of the guy with the politics you disagree with, firing somebody with politics that are different. Let's suppose politics that you agree with. In what way is that best for the guy you disagree with? Like if he's pursuing a conception of the good, a conception of the good life that you find abhorrent, that you think maybe is even self-destructive for him, I don't know. What's for the best about that in that case? Isn't your view that if he makes this choice voluntarily, he's going to do something bad?
Yeah.
So in what way is allowing this to be voluntary for the best for him? Because you said it was for the best for both.
So flesh out the situation a little more. So like I am firing. So now we want to pick a situation where I really think it's bad and not where I'm making myself a cartoon villain.
Yeah, like suppose he's a racist and he doesn't want to hire Democrats who are of the wrong race or whichever.
I'm confused.
I mean, you
how
picked the
racism
example you
got
want. It was your example.
Right, but I would want the all right. But so I refuse to deal with someone who I think, and I don't want to have whatever. I don't want to have someone on my social media platform who I think is fomenting a revolution or something, an unjust revolution or something. Okay, so what's the question now?
Well, the original example was
to
with
do
somebody
that.
who had the freedom to do something you thought was bad,
Mhm.
right? So I'm asking, in what way is that best for him? If it's something you think is bad.
In what way is it best for him to be free to do it? Or
Yeah.
in what way is it best for? Okay, I'm just missing where we are in the example.
Because it seems like to me this is the test case. Is if the test case for freedom is, does somebody have is there something good about the freedom to do the wrong thing? And if everybody only had the freedom to do the right single set of things, it wouldn't really be freedom.
Yeah, but the issue is that a human life is lived under the guidance of your own mind. If you don't have the scope to make the decisions for yourself, then you're not living that kind of life. And if you only have one path to do only what other people think, there's no way that it could always be the right path. And if it is the right path, or if it's the set of actions that is the one set of actions you're allowed to take, or the constrained set of actions you're allowed to take, happen to be the ones that you'd come up with and value if you had other options, it's the merest coincidence, and you're not going to understand them. They're not going to be the same ones. It's not the same actions where it's under coercion. But this is all kind of floating until we're actually thinking about the case. So what we're thinking about, the case I thought we were thinking about is the person who's, I'm just not sure where we are in the examples.
I mean, you gave an example of a hiring situation where there's somebody who had an ideology you disagreed with, firing someone because they didn't have the right ideology.
And so, okay, so there's the business owner who, to my way of thinking, irrationally fires
Right.
somebody. And the question is, why is it good that he be able to do that?
You said it was for the best if
Right.
people be able to interact voluntarily.
Because what his being able to fire that person means is that he's able to control his business. He has the scope of what business decisions to make, independent of my opinions of what the business decision should be, independent of my opinions of the prudence of those business decisions, and so forth. And that having that scope to make those decisions is necessary for somebody to be able to reach and implement true and good ideas in business. If he could only run his business the way I thought he should run his business, the way I thought it would be prudent to, by the policies I thought best, well, then we would only get as good businesses in the world as I am a businessman, and I'm not any kind of businessman, so we wouldn't have any good businesses. And if the standard isn't my conception of what running a business well is, but all of our vote on it, then we would only get businesses that are of the quality of the average person's vote as to what counts as a good business. If something's going to be exceptionally good, new, innovative, interesting, it's going to have to be something that other people hadn't thought of and didn't think of was good at first, and it has to be tried and proved to other people that they're right. And human beings live by the coming up with new ideas, the finding new things. So there's no way to give people the scope they need to live without enabling the scope for people to do things wrong. Experimentation, thinking, coming up with new things means, some of them are going to be wrong.
So is what you're saying something like this when you said it would be best for him? You meant something like, okay, he might actually end up making a decision that isn't any good for him.
Mm-hmm.
But the only scenario in which he could make a decision that's good for him is one where that's something he sees for himself. It's autonomous action on his part, where he hasn't done it because you forced him to do it, but because he did it of his own free will.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably true. But I think the broader point is the scope is good for him, even if the particular way he uses that scope on this occasion is bad.
Okay.
That people should have the ability to live their own lives for their own sakes is good for them. And it's good for all of us that people be able to do that, even though on many particular occasions they'll make unfortunate, unwise choices.
Okay. So that's interesting to me because when you talk to political philosophers about freedom,
Mhm.
you often get the view that the kind of classical liberal tradition, which values the kind of freedom that you're talking about here, where it's government's role to leave a sphere of protection around an individual's life so that they can make these kinds of choices without the interference from other people, so that they can pursue their own conceptions of the good. The view you often get from these philosophers is to be able to advocate that kind of freedom, you have to, as a philosopher, in some way, be value neutral, that you can't take at least the political view can't take a firm stance on a conception of the good. That would be perfectionist, is what they always call it. Because if you had, as a philosopher, this view of the good that human beings would achieve and should achieve, then you would be justified in trying to impose it on people. You'd be justified in forcing people to do the thing that is actually good and stopping them from doing what is inconsistent with it. But so this is new and novel, it sounds like, because you're saying both, on the one hand, there is a positive conception of the good that you think that you're standing up for, and you're saying it involves the life of the mind and the way in which reason's involved in creating and producing and trading values. But you're also saying that this same conception, the same positive conception of the good, is actually the reason why we should be free, and doesn't in any way license imposing some kind of conception of the good on people.
I mean, at one level, I want to say it's not new and novel. It's I think there's all kinds of intimations of it. There's in in Locke, in other Enlightenment thinkers, particularly earlier Enlightenment thinkers, or kind of proto-Enlightenment thinkers. It's certainly not novel to me because it's in Ayn Rand and others, but I think it's in a tradition going back to and before the American founding. But I do think that it is something that's very. So I don't think it's new relative to the term perfectionism or relative to the kind of Rawlsian idea that a liberal order has to be value neutral and so forth. I think that particular way of conceiving it is much newer than this idea that there is a right way for human beings to live, and that right way for human beings to live involves protecting a significant sphere of freedom, within which sphere of freedom they can make mistakes. However, I think all of these other ideas that you're saying, I think this kind of Enlightenment way of viewing freedom is new and revolutionary in the Enlightenment, never kind of fully takes hold. And the kind of ideas that you're saying are the old or standard ways are kind of new terminologies for lapsing back into an earlier way of thinking. That either there's skepticism, there's no answer to what's right or wrong or good or bad, and so people can be free, or there's some kind of knowledge of what's good, in which case that good could be forced or imposed. That's a kind of default way of thinking about it, but I think it's wrong, and it comes from not valuing the mind. Like, if you think of a mind as something that can direct a life, that is powerful and potent, and that is an attribute of the individual, then I think it follows from that individuals need significant scope to let their minds run their lives, including scope to make mistakes in doing that, including scope to do things that the person organizing or setting up the government might even know are mistakes. And I think you see bits of that, even back to pre-liberal. I think there's little bits of that in Aristotle, who I think is way too authoritarian and wrong on things, but less so than Plato, and I think in part for this kind of a reason.
Do we have another question?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand your position on employment between the employer that fires the employee because the employee is a Democrat. Do you think that should be permitted or not permitted?
I think it should be legal. I think it's a kind of, for most businesses, a foolish way to run your business.
Okay, but you do think it's that a Democrat's not a, quote, protected class.
Well, I don't know whether they are or not under current law. I guess that's part of the thing that's being sorted out, but I don't think there should be protected classes under law.
You don't think there should be?
Right.
Any protected classes?
Right.
So I should be able to fire you because of the color of your skin?
Yes, you'd be foolish to do it, and people would be wise to boycott you and so forth. But, yeah.
Yeah. I think the current law is we do have
we
employment
definitely
at will. You can fire someone for no reason, but you can't fire someone for, quote, the wrong reason.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and there are lots of reasons why it's illegal to fire people currently.
Correct, and I think there's probably a move to expand these, quote, protected classes to things that our founding fathers couldn't even dream of would exist.
Well, I don't think
years ago
they could have dreamt of the current ones either. And some of the things they couldn't have dreamt of are good, and they ought to have been able to have dreamt of them, or it would have been better if they had, but some of them are bad. But I think this whole this is part and parcel of the Civil Rights Act of '64, which had some provisions that I think did some fantastic and long overdue things, striking down Jim Crow laws in the southern states, but it also created protected classes against private discrimination. And I think that was that is, you can't refuse to serve someone in a restaurant, or refuse to hire someone, or fire someone because of their race, their gender, and I think their religion, but with some carve-outs maybe for religion if you're a religious institution. Creed, I think they call it, yeah. And I think that's a significant mistake in the law, and I think it's significant violation of rights, and I suspect that it's contributed to the sustenance of racism and sexism, which were starting to wane. But that's a large empirical question as to whether that's true.
Agreed.
So let me let me ask now another question about the conception of freedom that you are working with here, because if what's central to it is the freedom from force, which you see as the primary way in which people interfere with each other's lives,
Mhm.
and the reason why freedom from force is so central is that it interferes with people living by means of their own minds. Well, I guess, why is that? What is it about the nature of physical force? And maybe you should say a little more about what you mean by that, that does that. What is it about the nature of physical force that stops you from operating by your mind? So just, I'll give you one example to work with here. We were talking about various cases of threats. And it strikes me, at least, that if I say your money or your life, yeah, there's a sense in which I'm taking away your freedom, but somebody could say there's a sense in which you're still free. You're free to choose between your money or your life, and you can think about which of those would you rather give up, and you can even think about ways to
wrestle
get
the
out of
gun
the
away from
situation.
you and so
Right.
forth, and-
So, in what sense then, and then why is the sense important that there is some opposition between the force and the mind in that kind of case?
Well, I didn't put it as force on the mind in quite that way before, but this is this quote about Ayn Rand about force paralyzes and negates the mind and so forth, and that's what you're alluding to here. It's not exactly what I was saying before. I do think she's right about that, but that's just not how I put it before. So the way I see it, the fundamental issue is how we're dealing with one another. Are people dealing with one another by persuasion and trade, or by force? And that's the fundamental alternative: persuasion or force. And it's the question isn't, is being under force the most uniquely bad thing that could happen to you? You could get hit by a bolt of lightning, and that's as bad for you as anything that anybody could do to you, right? You'll just drop dead right there and then. Lots of bad things that can happen to you. And that could prevent you from using your mind. I mean, you're whatever, you're brain dead or comatose or in a stupor because you've been hit by the lightning. So the point isn't that someone threatening you harms you in a way that nothing else can. The point is that it harms you in a way nothing else they can do can. It makes, when we're in the realm of thinking how should and could human beings treat each other, there's a fundamental distinction between, are human beings interacting voluntarily such that they deal with each other only when it's to mutual benefit, by mutual judgment, and you always have the option of walking away from them? Or are people imposing themselves on you, acting towards you regardless of your will and thought in the matter? And if they're acting with respect to you in the second way, then I think they're fundamentally threats to you. Whereas if they're acting with respect to you in the first way, they're fundamentally boons to you, or else neutral. And so if we're thinking about how should we deal with one another, how should we demand that other people deal with us, how should we interact with people we meet, and how should we try to structure a society if we're a group of people coming together trying how to do it, in that context, this issue of force becomes paramount. It's, I think, the fundamental question about how do two people interact with one another. And there's a right and a wrong way to do it, given human nature and what we have to gain from one another and how it is that we gain it. And I think questions about the paralysis of the mind and so forth, and force in the mind, come up in that context, if we want to talk about them. But the fundamental thing I would make is the way of dealing with people is either trade or as either persuasion or force at the fundamental level. And I was saying why the one is good and the other is bad, without talking about it paralyzing the mind yet.
Well, I didn't mention paralyzing either, but now that you brought it up,
We're stopping.
I want to hear more about it, because supposing that, so it's a helpful formulation that it's not the only way your mind could be paralyzed. It's not that it's, how did you put it? You said it's the worst thing that another person could do to you.
Yeah, and even that is, I can come up with cases where there's some use of force somebody could do that would be less bad
But it's
than
the
some
it's
non-use
the
of
it's the
force.
worst thing a person can do to you with respect to organizing a society for the sake of how should we interact with how should we be allowed to interact with each other, especially with a view to what should the government do and how should the government draw some kind of boundaries around our lives. So then can you say more about that? Why is it that voluntary interaction, free from force, is that best way?
Because it's the way, I mean, the way I put it is interacting with one another by persuasion rather than by force. It's the way that respects the fact that each of us needs to live by his own judgment, and that everything each of us has to gain from any of the others comes from the others living that way as well. It's the way in which we can live together respecting one another's needs to live by their own judgment. That is, interacting with one another only when one another's judgment endorses the interaction, rather than trying to interact to override people's judgment and interact with them anyway. I think that's at root the basis of it.
So let's come back to the examples that we started with, perhaps, because maybe now we can have. Let's talk about free speech, because you said some things about why you thought people used the concept of free speech in the wrong way, why free speech doesn't entail free speech isn't violated when a social media company deplatforms someone or something like that. What does free speech give you? Why is it important from the perspective of this conception of freedom that we've just now been discussing? What values does it enable one to pursue in a social context? What kinds of voluntary interactions does it protect, and why is it important to do that?
Well, again, it's really just one thing, freedom. Are you able to go your own way from other people who disagree with you? Are you, or are you not? And what does it mean to say that that applies with speech? Well, it means the kinds of things that came up in the examples we were given. If I am saying things that you disagree with, are you able to shoot me, to punch me, to chain me up to stop me from saying them and gag me, or not? And if it turns out that you don't like the things I'm saying, am I able to compel you to stay and listen to them and talk to me? Or rather, do you say, like, I don't want to be on this podcast anymore. I don't like what you're saying. And we'll, go and have our own separate podcasts, our own separate lives where we don't talk to one another and deal with one another anymore. So it's the question of, are we free to come together, to work together, to say things together when we want to listen to what one another is saying, just like any other things we might be free to come together and do, and to disassociate ourselves when we don't want to. But only to disassociate ourselves, not otherwise to stop the other person from talking. So I can say, I'm not going to help you say what you want to say anymore. I'm not going to contribute to your cause anymore. I'm not going to go on shows with you. I'm not going to donate to organizations that support you. I'm not going to let you talk in my building or whatever. But I can't stop you in any way beyond withdrawing my endorsement, withdrawing my cooperation, right? That's what freedom means here. Now, why is it important that freedom applies to what we say? Well, because saying is important. Talking is the means by which we share ideas. And ideas are the most powerful things we create, the ways we're able to be of the most value to one another. Also, the ways we're able to, mess up the worst by coming up with really bad ideas that are ruinous and destructive in practice. But telling which ideas are right and wrong requires thinking them through, listening to arguments, sometimes hearing unwelcome or surprising arguments, being able to expose yourself to those things and seek them out to find the truth, right? And that requires that there be the freedom in in your community for people to say what they want to say.
And it strikes
Under
me
their own power, I should say. That is, funding, financing, finding people who are willing to support what they say and so forth, and not, compelling.
Good. So I don't have any more questions to ask you about this. Maybe other people do. It looks like we've got one person coming up to the mic, maybe two.
An interesting a thought that occurred to me is how objectivism gets freedom differently than anybody else. For example, libertarians' view of freedom is freedom from everything. I can do whatever I want. If I want to buy a tank, I should be able to buy a tank. And people who are from a mixed economy, they say, yeah, you can have freedom unless, you can only have property right so far as you are paying taxes, for example.
So I don't know if every single libertarian would describe their view that way, but
I think
certainly
the most consistent ones
are some who do. And this is one of the things I had in mind when I was asking this question about the way political philosophers think of classical political liberalism, is they make the point, no, the state can't have a conception of the good, and the philosophers shouldn't make it part of their political philosophy. But then some of these libertarians take that view very seriously in practice, and they say, well, who are you to judge what I want to do with my freedom? All these choices are equally good, and that's the reason why we should be free. But the objectivist view doesn't seem to have that view.
Well, I mean, the state has a certain job. There's a certain function it's needed for. And doing that job well requires, in a certain sense, being neutral on the topic of what people should devote their lives to. But some background conception of that is relevant to understanding the need for that kind of neutrality. So imagine an automobile company. Imagine you were thinking about how to manufacture automobiles. And like one view was a good automobile knows where you're going. It'll only take you to one place. The best place is Tulsa, and good automobiles just drive to Tulsa. And you get in them, and they take you to Tulsa. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe they all go to Dallas or whatever. But a good automobile is an automobile that can only go to that place. That's ridiculous, right? The part of what an automobile is for is to be able to take you to a variety of places and give you control over where you're going and so forth. And so does that mean that an automobile company, to manufacture a good automobile, has to be neutral on where you go? Yeah, in a certain sense. But also, they have to know something about, like, well, it's not for, driving through tundra. An automobile is a machine that enables the driver to travel on roads of a certain sort and gives them control over where they go on the roads. Well, likewise, a government has a certain function. What is its function? To enable people to live together free of one another, to enable people to live together not under force, to enable people to coexist in the same place, dealing with one another voluntarily, not involuntarily. Then there's a question as to why is that function a good function? Why do we need something in the world to do that? Just like there's a function like, why do we need such things as cars? And judgments about what's good and bad for human life and so forth go into, like, why is such a thing as a car good to have? And judgments about other background issues in philosophy go into the judgments about why is there a need for an institution that protects people's ability to live in that way. But part of the job of the institution isn't to promulgate, promote, etc., those views, just like part of the job of the car isn't to, like, tell you what the good places to go are, or like what's good about roads or whatever. It's just to let you drive.
I have another comment. In COVID, in my country,
Your country is Israel?
Israel, yes. There was a period where were not allowed to live 50 meters out of your house. But nevertheless, you were allowed to drive anywhere you want, so long as you're going to a protest. Which I thought is a bizarre conception of freedom, right? How would you?
Did it matter what you were protesting? Like, could you protest the 50 meters from your house thing? Could you drive to that?
You'd have to get approval from the police.
For the protest?
For the protest, yeah.
Would they have approved that one?
No, they would not have. So,
how is that on all kinds of
how does it come to that, when that's what people equate with freedom, going to protest?
Well, in general, the way, and I'm more familiar with the United States here than with Israel or really any other country, but if you take the United States where we have a Bill of Rights, right, the way that people have interpreted it is that the things mentioned in that bill are special. It's not like you have a right to liberty, and here we're giving you a sample of some of the areas where that applies. And so, you should notice if something overturns this area, it must be interfering with liberty. But it's not only these things, there are lots of ways to interfere with liberty. Rather, there's something special about religion, about printing presses, and the ones who are really abstract thinkers think maybe it doesn't have to be a press that you push down on, but applies to any form of media. But there's something special about these areas of life that require special protection. And I think that's in general how the tradition of liberalism has developed. There were certain special protected areas of rights that require special deference in the law. And one of them is the right to petition and protest the government. And in fact, those areas are special in a certain sense. They are areas that have been in which liberty has been particularly infringed upon in the past in ways that have had particular horrific results. The ability to petition your government for redress and to say you want things changed is really important. It is, in effect, it is basically just another, exercise of liberty. But it's a case in which there are kind of particular and well-known ways in which it stifles people to have that blocked. And so what modern liberal democracies tend to do is recognize a handful of these areas and not others, and have special carve-outs for them from other policies that are generally freedom violating. And I think that's what's going on when you have a situation of your freedoms are generally violated, but protest is special. Why is protest special? Well, because free people has to have a right to participate in their government. They have to be able to vote. They have to be able to share their ideas about what's wrong with the government so they can convince other people what to vote on and so forth. And so we'll make sure not to cut into liberty in this area, even while we're doing it everywhere else. And sometimes we'll cut into liberty other places in order to, maintain a carve-out in this area. Or what we think of as a carve-out in this area.
Perhaps another reason that accounts for the division of liberties into sacred versus dispensable, and it has something to do with their subject matter from a philosophic perspective, doesn't it? Because there's a view that, and here I have in mind what Ayn Rand says in her essay Censorship, Local and Express, about the differing attitudes between liberals and conservatives versus different views of freedom. The way she puts it is that at least the time of the writing, which has probably changed since then, the conservatives want to regulate the mind and leave the body free. The liberals want to regulate the body, leave the mind free. And there's various stereotypes that get read into what the body and the mind stand for there. But at the time, she sees it as the liberals are anti-censorship, but they want to regulate the economy. That's leaving the mind free, but regulating the body. And conservatives, vice versa. And there's a certain, you can read freedom of association and protest and so forth as that's related to the speech end of things, which is the mind. And they value the mind, but not the body. The body will infect people and so forth, even though it could still infect them at the protest. And there's a mind-body split there in philosophy, where you see one as valuable, not the other, or vice versa. And the point that you're making about how freedom is one, I think goes hand in hand, at least in objectivism, with the view
freedom
that
is O-N-E or W-O-N?
O-N-E, that freedom is one thing. There's not this split between the economic freedom versus personal freedom, public freedom, private freedom. There's just freedom, and part of the reason is that mind and body are not these separate entities with separate values from objectivism's perspective, that there's this integration between body and mind. And some of the things we've been talking about today illustrate that, right? Insofar as, how do you actually acquire knowledge. You don't just have a disembodied mind that does thinking. You have to go out into the world and talk to people and learn things from them and be in the same physical space as them. Or if not that, then you're using some physical tools that allow you to communicate with them through a computer or a telephone. And there's no way of separating these issues.
I think that's right, but I wonder if, I mean, in the case of someone for dating, for example, and be romantically with people you want to be with, but you can't if you can't go from your house and they're in another house, right? Like, are curtailed. That I think it requires a special explanation why there's a carve out for political protest over and above a whole lot of other issues. And I think there's the idea that participation in the government, a political protest is about democracy. It's about having a voice in your own government, and that has this special quality.
And we had a case of the same thing in the U.S. where when the Supreme Court decided that it was an unconstitutional violation of the freedom of religion to shut down religious services. But if a bunch of people got together in the same kind of space, the same number of people who could have just as equally infected each other, if it was for a political rally or if it was for a business meeting, that's different.
Yeah, I mean, there is there's a kind of mockery of the regulations that I think was a little bit on the wrong premise. I think a lot of these regulations were wrong, were violations of rights, were inappropriate, but there was this premise like there were the same number of people at this supermarket as would be at my, I don't know, hockey intramural, but I'm allowed to go to the supermarket and I'm not allowed to go to the hockey intramural. Why is that? And
well, in a case like that, you could make an argument that you need to get food.
Right, and then the issue is,
but it's not as easy to make that argument with the religion versus the
so
politics.
The issue is like, you're some of these contexts are inevitable. You're going to have some of them anyway. And what we're trying to do is minimize how much of it there could be. And a plausible policy that somebody might enact for themselves, as to like how I'm going to minimize my exposure to a pathogen I'm trying to avoid, might be to do the things that I have to do or feel are important enough to me, but not do some things that are equally risky because I want to, each risk I undertake, even if they're of the same magnitude, loads up on my total amount of risk I'm taking. But the problem with these restrictions is that they're imposing a value hierarchy on everybody. That's not everybody's value hierarchy. And okay, in a super emergency situation, you could say, well, food everyone needs or they'll die tomorrow, and other things aren't like that. But as soon as you're past any like super emergency lengths of time, there's obviously these arbitrary and parochial value hierarchies that are being imposed, where this thing is considered important enough by the people who are making the regulations and others aren't, or there's a good enough lobbying group, and so like, golf, where the golf lobby was good enough, was allowed in some, but some other similarly activity wasn't, and it just had to do with who had pull and so forth. And this is how things work in a mixed economy, and it's arbitrary and it's bad.
It strikes me, this relates to our previous conversation about the freedom, the value of the freedom to be irrational, and not just because of that point, but that part of what makes freedom important and why everyone needs to be able to make decisions is not even that there's one right thing everybody should do, and yet there's still some value in being able to do the wrong thing. Is that there's a range of right things that people need to be able to do, because different people there can be equally rational optional differences in value hierarchies.
Yeah, I mean, life is a problem. I mean, it's a bad thing. Like a math problem, or a thing to be worked out, or to be solved, or to be figured out. Each life individually, There's not one solution, except at a very abstract level, to how to live. There are a million ways, just like there's not only one song to be written, or one novel to be written, or one building to be built, or one career to be had. There are indefinitely many of these. There are principles governing what things are songs versus just noise, are novels versus mere collections of words, or works in some other genre, and are human lives versus processes of slow death or destruction. But nevertheless, there's, you know, indefinitely many such lives, the real lives, and each one can only be figured out by the person who's doing it. And there are many ways for the person to go wrong, and also many ways for the person to go right. But it requires individual acts of judgment by each person about what's going to matter to them. And we live by forming and pursuing values over time, ranked in hierarchies and connected into networks that are self-sustaining wholes. And there's no such thing as essential and non-essential values, or essential and non-essential tasks, or essential and non-essential activities over the course of a life. You can decide for you what's essential and what's non-essential, and maybe movies aren't and education isn't, but there's no, like, everything you do contributes to your living, or you're mistaken about it, but nobody else can figure it out or tell it for you. And except these differences of what's essential or not, are only differences of scale. You'll die in how many hours without water and how many years without art or social connection, or whatever the thing may be. But I want to hear from Puya.
Hey, I wanted to know what you think of this idea that freedom is impossible or useless without independence, such that if you're living parasitically onto other people, then it is the same thing as if you're living without a freedom, even if you're living in a free society.
Which kind of independence do you mean?
Independence about your life, independence that the things that your life needs you can produce for yourself, or at least know how to produce for yourself.
So who thinks that freedom isn't meaningful without independence?
Namely, Maria Montessori thinks that.
I don't know her reasons for thinking that. It strikes me that there's a certain point to it, which is that if you're given freedom and you don't use it in the sense of acting rationally, making a productive life for yourself, then you're wasting a gift. But that's something you can say about one person who is in that situation, not about the total condition of freedom, right? It would still be meaningful to the other people who are using it. But I would have to know more about her reasons for thinking that.
There are people who lead lives as bad as can be under conditions of freedom, who make messes of their lives. Certainly there are people, if they don't live lives as bad as could be lived in the worst dictatorship, who, are living in much freer conditions than other people and who are making much worse of their lives. That's not the standard or what's typical, but what freedom is an opportunity to live. But I don't like the idea of, how did you put it, freedom is useless without independence, or no good to you without independence? Because what freedom is precisely the opportunity to exercise independence. And independence, and I don't even like the word exercise, because that sounds like some people have this trait of independence and some don't, and if you have it, then maybe you can exercise it, but if you don't have it, you couldn't have exercised it to begin with. But virtues aren't like that, at least not the way I understand virtues. Everyone is capable of thinking for himself. Everyone is capable of making decisions. You might be better at it, better at making decisions, better at bucking trends, better at more creative, more individualistic, but the kind of core thing everyone's capable of doing, and is capable of doing all the time, in terms of just as a kind of it's in human nature. You get all kinds of ways better at it, and it can become more second nature. But the basic capability or the choice is there. And the question is, are you in a situation where you're existentially free to act on your own judgment, where the people around you are not trying to kill, shoot, imprison, enslave, otherwise impose themselves on you, unless you make, you use your choice in very particular ways. If you are in that situation, it's going to be the ability to make those choices is not going to be able to play its natural and proper role in your life. And it's going to, in one way or another, have to atrophy or develop along distorted or perverted lines unless you can find a way to free yourself from that. And so it's not like some people have independence and they were always going to have it and we're going to have it anyway and we're going to maintain it for their whole lives. And then if those people get freedom, they're aces. And other people were never going to have it and never were born without it or somehow failed to develop it early and could never develop it. And so whether they're in freedom or dictatorship, it's all the same to them. They're going to be, ballast. Every moment you're able to think and make choices and act on them or to default on that. And you're either living in a social environment where the goodness and rightness of that is respected, such that it's possible for you to benefit by doing that, or you're living in a social environment where people have made themselves the enemies of your life, and you're not able to, in which case you won't be able to benefit from doing that, and you'll either, die or have to stop or be really constrained. And so I don't think it's quite true that freedom is only good for you if you have independence. You can only really let your independence flower under freedom. And the thing that can become independence isn't something that people have and other people don't have. It's something that's accessible to anyone. They can develop it more or less, but they need the freedom to be able to, to use them to develop it. That's how I think of it.
But you could have a situation where they have the freedom and still don't develop it.
But the point is that it's not, if you say freedom is only useful to people who are independent, it sounds as though there's a class of independent people and a class of non-independent people,
Right.
and they're going to be in one of these two classes regardless of whether they get freedom, and the freedom is only going to be useful to the people who are in the one class. You're not going to be able to use your independence unless you're free, true, but you're not going to be able to develop or let your independence flower. So that's there's a kind of unidirection of the causality, I think, to that way of thinking of that's implied by that way of putting the statement that I don't think is right.
All right. We don't have any questions from online, and there's no one else.
I think we're
waiting.
at a reasonable time
Yeah.
to end. We've been about over an hour.
Do you want to say maybe more again
yes.
about this week's event?
So speaking of places where people are not free, we have here pictured an example of, I think, real independence flowering in Iran with women protesting, taking off their hijabs, standing up to the morality police, and quite a movement that's developed there, and a real opposition to one of the most anti-freedom, maybe the most anti-freedom regime in the world, in contention certainly for it. Pictured below that on this poster behind me, we have people standing up to the kinds of draconian COVID restrictions that we heard about before, but in the place that kind of wrote the book for draconian COVID restrictions, China. And we have in this picture a kind of protest that went a little beyond just standing up to that, but saw it as a wider issue of freedom being denied, as indicated by the holding up of white pieces of paper, indicating that they're not able to say anything on the pieces of paper because there's censorship. So we have these two protest movements, particularly among young people, having flowered in recent months over the in Iran and China, and Yaron Brook is coming on Thursday night to give a talk about these. He's going to talk about the kind of moral significance of them generally, and the inspiration for it. The title comes from a Farsi song that is based on a lot of tweets, people protesting why they're part of this movement, and because of this, because of that, and listing the different reasons. And the one that we've picked for a title is "Because of the Yearning for an Ordinary Life." What is an ordinary life? What are these people fighting for? What are they lacking? Do we have it here? How ordinary is what we think of as an ordinary way of life, and what's meant by that? And these are the issues that Dr. Brook is going to address in a talk over at Rolling Hall, Crum Auditorium, on this Thursday evening, 2 days from today. And I invite all of you listening online and in the room to come. So that's our next event. We will also be back here with another podcast episode on a week from today on Tuesday. I'm not sure exactly who the personnel will be, but Ankar Gate, I think, will be. It might just be me and him, or me and him and Ben, or Ben and him. We're sorting it out. But that'll be our podcast on Tuesday. We're not sure what we're going to talk about, but maybe egalitarianism, one topic that's been on our minds. In any case, we will hope to see everyone on Thursday and again on Tuesday. Both events will be live streamed on the same BAT channel. I'm going to be able to update that old reference. Anyway, on the same internet channel. Oh, and also, Michael is reminding me that there is now an Ayn Rand club here at the University of Texas that's going to be working with the co-sponsoring some events with the Objectivism Program. And Michael, what can people do if they want to learn about the club or get involved? But what do they do on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram? But what piece of information do I give them so that they can find you? Ayn Rand Club Austin or something? Ayn Rand Club ATX.
_ATX.
_ATX.
On Twitter.
Okay. Cool.
Or just search Ayn Rand Club at the University of Texas.
All right. And by those techniques, you will find the new club. And we hope to see you all on Thursday and Tuesday, in person or online. Your choice.
Oh, we got it on tape.